When I first heard about the recent Yeti sightings in the remote Canadian wilderness, I was halfway through cataloging a list of hoaxes for my cryptid research blog. My setup was simple: a cluttered desk, a stubborn laptop, and a pinboard behind me filled with a chaotic array of thumbtacked photos, red string, and scribbled notes. That night, the storm outside rattled the windows, but my focus was glued to the latest video submission from a man claiming he'd seen the creature. The footage was shaky, classic vertical phone video, but the fear in his voice was unmistakable. His breath hitched as the camera panned over a snowy ridge. There, a massive figure lumbered against the blizzard, its silhouette impossibly large, its arms swinging with a primate's gait. "It's staring at me," the man whispered before the screen went black. In the hours that followed, I scoured forums, news clippings, and social media posts. More sightings popped up, most dismissed as pranks or wild imagination. But a pattern emerged. All the witnesses spoke of the Yeti as a beast of pure terror, stalking campsites, shadowing hikers, and vanishing into the trees before anyone could react. Yet, beneath the surface, the stories didn't quite align. One hiker claimed the Yeti had thrown rocks to scare them away from a cliff edge. Another said they'd woken to find their fire mysteriously restocked with fresh wood. These oddities didn't scream hostility. They suggested something else entirely. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than the typical monster in the woods story. The obsession settled over me like a second skin. I started mapping the sightings on a topographic map of the Canadian wilderness, marking hotspots and probable migration patterns. The more I dug, the more I was convinced this wasn't just folklore. 2 weeks later, I found myself on the doorstep of Emery Callahan, a former park ranger turned recluse. He lived in a ramshackle cabin on the outskirts of Jasper National Park, where some of the most harrowing Yeti stories had emerged. The first thing that hit me was the silence. It wasn't the kind of peaceful quiet you'd expect in the forest. It was oppressive, almost as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Callahan's cabin leaned awkwardly against a backdrop of pines, its roof sagging and windows crusted with grime. The smell of damp wood and unwashed clothes hit me as he opened the door. Callahan looked worse than the cabin. His sunken eyes darted between me and the tree line behind me, his wiry frame tense as if ready to bolt. He had the air of someone haunted by memories too heavy to bear. "You're wasting your time," he said, his voice hoarse, before I could finish introducing myself. "I've got nothing to say about it." I pressed, careful to keep my tone steady. "You mean the Yeti, don't you?" His face twisted at the word, a flash of fear crossing his features. He started to close the door, but I wedged my foot in. "Please," I said quickly. "I'm not here to mock you or exploit your story. I'm just trying to understand. Whatever you saw, I believe you." For a long moment, he stared at me, the tension palpable. Finally, he sighed and stepped aside, muttering, "Your funeral." Inside, the cabin was dimly lit and cluttered. Newspaper clippings and maps of the park littered a table, along with a coffee mug that had clearly gone cold hours ago. Callahan slumped into a threadbare armchair, gesturing for me to sit. "What do you want to know?" he asked, his voice low. "Start from the beginning," I urged. "Tell me what happened." For a while, he didn't speak, just stared into the fire crackling weakly in the stone hearth. When he finally did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It was 2 years ago," he began. "I was out checking a remote trail after a bad storm. A couple of hikers reported downed trees blocking the path. Figured it'd be an easy job. Clear the debris, check for damage, head back by sundown. But something was off that day. The woods were too quiet. No bears, no wind, just nothing." He trailed off, rubbing his hands together as if to ward off a chill that wasn't there. I stayed silent, letting him find his way through the memory. "Then I saw it," he said, his voice cracking. "It was crouched by a stream, maybe 50 yards ahead. At first I thought it was a bear, but it stood up," and he shuddered, gripping the arms of the chair. "It wasn't a bear. It was tall, taller than any man I've ever seen. And its eyes, they weren't animal eyes. They were aware." "What did it do?" I prompted. "It looked at me," he said simply. Then it started walking toward me. Not running, not charging, just walking. He paused, swallowing hard. I panicked, turned, and ran like hell. But I tripped, smashed my head on a rock. Everything went black. When he spoke again, his voice was almost inaudible. When I came to, I was leaning against a tree. My head was wrapped in bandages, and my pack was next to me. The path back to the ranger station had been cleared, but there were footprints in the mud. Big ones, leading away from where I'd been lying. "Wait," I said, leaning forward. "You're saying it helped you?" Callahan's eyes flicked up to mine, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of something: anger, fear, or maybe guilt. "That's the thing," he said bitterly. "I don't know. Maybe it saved me. Maybe it was just toying with me. Either way, I never went back to that trail." I pressed him for more details, but he clammed up, retreating into his silence. As I left the cabin, his parting words lingered. "Some things in those woods aren't meant to be understood. If you're smart, you'll leave it alone." But as the wind whispered through the pines and the mountains loomed in the distance, I knew I wouldn't. The Yeti was out there, and I had to find it, whatever the cost. It took weeks of preparation before I was ready to set out into the heart of the Canadian wilderness. Between the supplies, maps, satellite phone, and sheer courage it required, I wondered if I was insane to even consider it. The forest I planned to explore stretched for miles in every direction. An endless sea of trees broken only by the occasional mountain ridge or frozen river. Few ventured there, and those who did seldom stayed long. But something about Callahan's story clung to me like a shadow. His words echoed in my mind. Some things in those woods aren't meant to be understood. The warning only fueled my curiosity. By the time I parked my car at the edge of the trailhead, the early morning sky had begun to blush with light. The cold stung my face as I secured my pack, double-checked my compass, and headed into the trees. The first day passed uneventfully. I followed the marked trail until it disappeared into the undergrowth, a fading memory of civilization. By evening, I had pitched my tent in a small clearing. The fire crackled as I ate a dinner of dried fruit and jerky, feeling the stillness of the wilderness settle around me. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. Inside the tent, I wrapped myself tightly in a sleeping bag, letting the rhythm of the wind lulling me toward sleep. Just as I began to drift off, there was a sound, a faint snapping of branches far off in the distance. My eyes shot open, heart pounding. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or an owl rustling about. But for the first time, I felt the forest was more alive than it seemed. By the third day, I was far off the map, navigating with a combination of GPS and intuition. The air was crisp, the mornings blanketed in frost. Yet something intangible had begun to gnaw at my nerves, a sensation of being watched. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. But by the time I stumbled across the first set of footprints, I couldn't pretend any longer. They were massive, easily twice the size of a man's boot. The impressions sank deep into the damp soil, suggesting immense weight. Around the edges of each print were faint drag marks, as if claws had scraped against the earth. I crouched to inspect them more closely. The prints weren't fresh, but they weren't old either, maybe a day, two at most. My pulse quickened. There were no reports of bears in this part of the forest, and no animal I knew of would leave tracks like these. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. Whatever had made them, it was nearby. That night, I camped in another clearing, though sleep eluded me. The forest around my tent seemed alive with subtle sounds. The rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and occasionally, the unmistakable crack of a branch snapping underfoot. At one point, I thought I saw a movement just beyond the firelight, a fleeting shadow among the trees. I called out, more to break the silence than anything else. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the vastness of the woods. No response. By dawn, my nerves were frayed, but I pressed on. I told myself the isolation was getting to me, that I was imagining things. Yet as I packed up my gear, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There on the ground near my tent were more of those massive footprints. They circled the clearing, stopping mere feet from where I had been sleeping. By the fifth day, the forest seemed to close in around me. The towering pines cast long shadows that stretched like fingers across the ground, and the air grew colder the deeper I ventured. It was mid-afternoon when I stumbled upon the second strange sign. This time, it wasn't tracks but a series of deep gouges carved into the bark of a tree. Each groove was thick and jagged, as if something with immense strength had raked claws against it. The marks were fresh. Sap still oozed from the wounds in the wood. I scanned the surrounding area, my breath visible in the frigid air. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. I took a step back, the crunch of leaves underfoot unnaturally loud. And then I heard it, a low, guttural sound that didn't belong to the wind. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound came again, distant yet distinct. It wasn't an animal call, at least not one I recognized. It was deeper, almost vocal, like the rumble of a massive chest exhaling. Instinct screamed at me to turn back, but something deeper, curiosity, obsession, kept me rooted to the spot. I waited, straining my ears for any hint of movement, but the sound didn't come again. By the time night fell, I was on edge, my nerves stretched thin. I pitched my tent in a dense grove, hoping the extra cover would make me feel safer. It didn't. Sleep was impossible. Every noise outside the thin fabric walls felt amplified. The whisper of wind through the trees, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig. And then came the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy, crunching through the undergrowth just outside the grove. I held my breath. Clutching the knife, I kept at my side. The steps circled the tent once, twice, then stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. I waited, every muscle in my body coiled like a spring. Minutes passed, then an hour, before I finally let out a shaky breath. Whatever had been out there was gone. At dawn, I emerged cautiously, scanning the grove for any signs of activity. The ground around the tent was undisturbed, as if the night's events had been nothing more than a vivid nightmare. But as I packed up and prepared to move on, I caught sight of something in the distance, another set of tracks, leading deeper into the forest. They were larger than the ones I'd seen before, and they were fresh. By now, the forest had taken on a sinister character. The further I ventured into its depths, the more oppressive the air became. The pines stretched impossibly tall, their needle-clad branches blocking out even the brightest daylight. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, pooling in the corners of my vision like ink seeping into paper. On the seventh day, I reached a stretch of dense woodland so quiet it felt unnatural. The usual rustle of leaves and chirps of unseen birds were absent. The silence seemed to press in on me, thick and stifling, broken only by the crunch of my boots on frozen ground. That night, I set up camp near a cluster of massive boulders. The rocks offered some semblance of security, a natural barrier against whatever I couldn't explain that had been circling me since my arrival. The fire crackled weakly as the last light of day faded. The cold bit through my layers, and I pulled my jacket tighter, staring into the flickering flames. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to rest. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind, set my nerves on edge. Then, just as the fire burned down to embers, I heard it, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the trees. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound came again, low and drawn out, somewhere between a growl and a moan. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Gripping the handle of my knife, I forced myself to look beyond the firelight into the darkness. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows dancing like specters. I saw nothing, but the sound lingered, echoing in the stillness. The next night, the noises grew louder. The first crack of a branch jolted me awake, my heart hammering in my chest. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling to switch it on as I strained to hear through the walls of the tent. Another crack, then another. It wasn't just one sound. It was a series of deliberate movements, circling the perimeter of my camp. Something or someone was out there. I unzipped the tent just enough to shine the light into the darkness. The beams swept across the trees, illuminating nothing but gnarled trunks and fallen branches. Still, the noises continued, now joined by a faint shuffling sound. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. "Who's there?" No response. By the third night, sleep was a distant memory. My body was on edge, every nerve screaming at me to turn back. But curiosity and pride kept me rooted to the spot. The fire had burned low when I heard the first sound, a deep, resonant exhale. It wasn't the wind. The sound came again, closer this time. Slowly, I rose from my seat, every muscle in my body taut. The firelight flickered weakly as I strained to see beyond its reach. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark shape looming at the edge of the clearing. But as my eyes adjusted, the figure came into focus. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung low at its sides. Its fur was dark and matted, blending seamlessly with the surrounding forest. But its eyes were the most unsettling part. They glowed faintly in the firelight, reflecting the flames with an eerie intelligence. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it took a step forward. I stumbled back, nearly falling over the fire in my panic. The creature halted, tilting its head as if studying me. My heart pounded in my chest, and my grip on the knife tightened. The Yeti took another step, its massive hand brushing against a tree trunk. The sound of its claws scraping the bark sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my pack, I bolted into the darkness, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly as I ran. Branches clawed at my face and arms, the forest blurring around me in a haze of panic. Behind me, I heard it, a deep, guttural call that shook the air, followed by the heavy thud of footsteps. It wasn't chasing me, but it wasn't retreating either. I don't know how far I ran before I tripped. One moment, I was sprinting through the undergrowth. The next, my foot caught on a root, and I went down hard. Pain shot through my leg as I hit the ground, my flashlight skidding away into the darkness. I groaned, clutching my ankle. The pain was sharp and immediate, a searing reminder of my own recklessness. Somewhere in the distance, the footsteps stopped. I lost consciousness. When I opened my eyes, I didn't recognize where I was. The first thing I noticed was the dim, flickering light filtering in through cracks in the stone above me. It cast long, uneven shadows across the rough walls of what could only be described as a cave. My head throbbed, and my body felt heavy, as though gravity had increased tenfold. When I tried to move, pain shot through my leg, sharp and immediate, grounding me to the spot. I looked down to find my ankle tightly splinted with thick branches and what seemed to be strips of bark. The splint was crude but functional, and it was bound with surprising precision, as if crafted by someone or something with a deft touch. My heart pounded as I took in the rest of my surroundings. A pile of leaves and moss lay under me, serving as a makeshift bed. Beside it, a small collection of forest berries and roots had been carefully arranged on a flat rock. My mind raced. Who had brought me here? Or rather, what? The last thing I remembered was running blindly through the forest, the cold air burning my lungs and branches tearing at my clothes. The Yeti, its immense figure, its glowing eyes, flashed in my memory. Had it followed me? Or worse, had it caught me and dragged me here? I tried to calm my breathing, to make sense of it all. The splint, the food, it didn't add up. If the creature wanted to hurt me, it could have done so back in the clearing. Instead, it had tended to my injuries, even providing sustenance. Why? Hours passed. The cave was eerily quiet, save for the occasional drip of water echoing from deeper within. I tried to move, but my leg protested violently, forcing me to stay put. And then I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. My breath caught in my throat as the silhouette of something massive appeared at the mouth of the cave. The firelight cast it in shadow, but there was no mistaking the broad shoulders, long arms, and shaggy fur. The Yeti stepped into view, ducking slightly to avoid the low ceiling. For a moment, neither of us moved. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain it could hear it. The creature's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the same unsettling mix of fear and fascination that had gripped me during our first encounter. But this time, there was something else: curiosity. The Yeti didn't advance aggressively. It tilted its head, its movements slow and deliberate, as if trying to gauge my reaction. In the firelight, I could see its face more clearly. Its features were rough, yet strangely expressive. Its eyes, a deep amber, held a glint of intelligence that sent a shiver down my spine. It took another step forward, then stopped, watching me intently. I stayed perfectly still, clutching the knife I'd found in my pack. But as the seconds ticked by, I began to realize the creature wasn't threatening me. Instead, it crouched, lowering itself to my level. The Yeti extended a massive hand, palm up, as if offering peace. My grip on the knife tightened instinctively, but the creature didn't react. It simply waited, its eyes flicking between the blade and my face. Hesitantly, I set the knife down. The Yeti's shoulders relaxed slightly, and it reached toward the flat rock where the berries and roots were piled. Picking up a handful of the food, it held it out to me. I hesitated. Was this some sort of test? Slowly, I reached out and took the offering, half expecting the creature to lash out. But it didn't. Instead, it let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a growl, but something softer, almost like a purr. As the hours passed, the Yeti stayed nearby, observing me with quiet curiosity. It didn't speak, not in words at least, but its gestures were surprisingly clear. When I shivered, it nudged a pile of moss closer to me. When I tried to shift positions, wincing in pain, it motioned for me to stay still. Its actions were thoughtful. At one point, it pointed to my leg, then mimed walking with exaggerated movements. It wanted to know if I could stand. I shook my head, and the Yeti let out a low grunt, its brow furrowing in what looked like concern. It left the cave briefly, returning with more berries and a handful of thick branches. I watched as it reinforced the splint on my leg, its massive hands moving with surprising gentleness. Over the next few days, a fragile rhythm developed between us. The Yeti would leave the cave at dawn, returning hours later with food or materials. It would sit near the fire, watching me as I ate, its gaze never leaving me for long. Despite its size and strength, it never once displayed aggression. If anything, it seemed protective, almost nurturing. One evening, as the firelight danced on the cave walls, the Yeti picked up a stick and began to draw in the dirt. At first, I couldn't make sense of the shapes, circles, lines, and what looked like crude figures. But as it continued, a pattern emerged. It was drawing the forest. There, etched into the dirt, were the familiar ridges and valleys I had seen on my map. The Yeti pointed to one of the marks, then to the cave entrance. It was showing me where we were. Then it pointed to another mark, a cluster of trees far to the east. It grunted, its eyes meeting mine. "Is that where you live?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The Yeti tilted its head, then nodded, or something close to it. That night, as I lay on the moss bed, my mind raced. This creature, this thing that I had feared and hunted for so long, was nothing like the monster I had imagined. It wasn't stalking me out of malice. It was guiding me, helping me survive. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected: trust. As I drifted off to sleep, the Yeti sat by the fire, its hulking figure silhouetted against the flames. It glanced at me once, its amber eyes soft and thoughtful, before turning back to the cave's entrance. I realized then that it wasn't just protecting me. It was watching over me. Survival had become a shared effort between me and the Yeti. What began as silent observation had evolved into an unlikely alliance. Each day brought a new challenge, and each day, the Yeti found some way to rise to it. When I woke, it was often gone, off foraging or scouting the area. By the time the sun pierced the cracks in the cave ceiling, it would return with its massive hands cradling berries, roots, or even small game. Sometimes it carried more branches, inspecting my splint with a critical eye before silently reinforcing it. My trust in the creature grew. Slowly, the fear that had dominated our initial encounters ebbed away, replaced by a cautious respect. This was no beast. It was a protector, an ally, maybe even a friend. As the days stretched into a week, I grew more curious about the Yeti itself. Its intelligence was undeniable, but it still carried an air of mystery that left me grappling for answers. One morning, as it tended to the fire, I decided to test the bond we had formed. "I don't know if you understand me," I said, breaking the silence. "But thank you." The Yeti turned, its amber eyes meeting mine. For a moment, I felt foolish, talking to something that couldn't respond. But then it grunted softly and dipped its head, a gesture that could only be described as acknowledgement. Over time, the Yeti began including me in its routines, despite my limited mobility. It would gesture for me to watch as it prepared food, showing me which berries to eat and which to avoid. When my strength improved, it encouraged me to practice standing, always staying close in case I faltered. On one such occasion, I leaned too far forward and began to stumble. Before I could hit the ground, its massive hand shot out, steadying me with surprising gentleness. "Guess I've got a ways to go," I muttered, earning a soft chuff from the Yeti. If I didn't know better, I'd have said it was amused. It was during one of its absences that I discovered the carvings. The cave stretched deeper than I'd realized, its winding passages leading into near-total darkness. My curiosity got the better of me, and using a small torch fashioned from dry branches and moss, I began to explore. The walls of the tunnel were lined with markings, simple at first, but growing more intricate as I ventured further. Symbols I didn't recognize spiraled along the stone, interspersed with crude depictions of animals and figures. Near the end of the passage, the air grew cooler, and the tunnel opened into a small chamber. There in the center of the room stood a stone pedestal. Resting atop, it was an object I couldn't quite identify. It looked like a mask carved from wood and decorated with faintly shimmering paints. Its design was intricate, almost ceremonial, and the hollow eyes seemed to watch me as I approached. Around the pedestal were more carvings, this time depicting scenes of conflict. One showed figures resembling humans wielding tools and fire, encroaching upon the forest. Another depicted a massive figure, undoubtedly the Yeti, standing between them and the trees. The final carving caught my breath. It showed the Yeti holding a smaller figure, human by the looks of it, and guiding them away from danger. I sat in the chamber for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. These weren't random artifacts, they told a story. The Yeti wasn't just a creature of legend, it was a guardian, a protector of this sacred land, standing against those who sought to exploit it. When the Yeti returned to the cave that evening, I couldn't look at it the same way. It must have noticed the change in my demeanor, because it cocked its head, grunting softly as if to ask what was wrong. "I found the carvings," I said, knowing it wouldn't understand the words, but hoping it might recognize the intent. I think I understand now. Why you're here. Why you're helping me." The Yeti didn't respond immediately. Instead, it walked to the fire and sat down, its gaze distant. For the first time, it seemed weary. The next day, I asked the Yeti to take me to the forest it protected. I gestured toward the drawings in the dirt it had made earlier, pointing to the mark that represented the trees to the east. It hesitated at first, but eventually relented. The journey was slow, my injured leg making progress difficult. But the Yeti was patient, always stopping to help when the terrain became too rough. When we finally reached the grove, I was struck by its beauty. The trees here were ancient, their trunks thick and gnarled, their canopies stretching high above. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting the forest floor in a golden glow. At the heart of the grove stood a massive stone circle, overgrown with moss and vines. It was clear this place held significance, though its purpose was a mystery. The Yeti stood at the edge of the circle, its massive frame silhouetted against the light. It looked at me, then at the stones, as if waiting for me to understand. And I did. This wasn't just a forest. It was a sanctuary, a place untouched by time, where nature's balance had been preserved. And the Yeti, it was the guardian of that balance, ensuring the forest remained undisturbed. That night, as we returned to the cave, I felt a strange sense of peace. Despite the danger, Despite the unknown, I was beginning to see the forest through the Yeti's eyes. It wasn't a monster. It was a protector. And for the first time, I wondered if I had been the intruder all along. It began with the Yeti's urgency. For days, our movements had been cautious and deliberate, my recovery dictating our pace. But that morning, the Yeti's demeanor shifted. Its usual calm was replaced by a subtle restlessness, its amber eyes scanning the horizon as if anticipating something. When it gestured for me to follow, there was no mistaking the tension in its movements. Whatever had unsettled it was urgent. We traveled further than we had before, my splinted leg a constant hindrance. Despite the strain, the Yeti didn't let up, pausing only to ensure I was keeping up. The forest, normally a sanctuary, felt different today. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves drowned out by a strange silence. After hours of trekking, the trees began to thin, and the Yeti stopped abruptly. It turned to me, its massive hand rising to point ahead. There, beyond the final line of trees, the forest opened into a wide, devastated expanse. The destruction hit me like a punch to the gut. Where once the forest had stretched endlessly, there was now nothing but a wasteland of stumps and churned-up earth. Towering machines clawed at the ground, their mechanical arms ripping trees from the soil with brutal efficiency. Smoke rose from piles of burning debris, staining the sky a dull gray. The Yeti stood at the edge of the devastation, its broad shoulders slumping as it took in the scene. I didn't need words to understand what it felt. Sorrow. For a long time, neither of us moved. I watched as workers scurried around the machines like ants, their shouts blending with the relentless grind of machinery. Trucks loaded with timber trundled down crude dirt roads, their tires leaving deep ruts in the scarred ground. It was a war zone, and the forest was losing. "This is why you're here," I murmured, my voice barely audible over the din. "This is what you've been fighting against." The Yeti let out a low, mournful rumble. Its eyes, which had always seemed so full of strength, now reflected a deep sadness. As we watched, something caught my eye. Near the edge of the operation, a small group of workers had gathered. They seemed agitated, their voices raised as they pointed toward the forest. I squinted, trying to make out what they were saying. "Damn thing's been spotted again. Tracks all over the place. Bigger than any bear I've seen. Boss says we're organizing a hunt tonight. Can't have it spooking the crew anymore." My stomach turned. They were talking about the Yeti. We retreated into the forest, the Yeti's pace slower now, its steps heavy with the weight of what we had seen. Back at the cave, I couldn't stop replaying the workers' words. A hunting party meant guns, dogs, and a determination to kill. The Yeti, for all its strength and intelligence, was no match for a coordinated effort. "You've never hurt anyone," I said aloud, as if speaking to myself would make it all make sense. "All you've done is protect this place, and now they want to kill you for it." The Yeti sat near the fire, its gaze distant. I wondered how much it understood of the danger it was in. As night fell, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. The usual nocturnal symphony was replaced by an oppressive stillness, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I barely slept, my mind racing with possibilities. Could I warn the workers? Convince them to call off the hunt? But the thought of explaining the Yeti's true nature seemed impossible. They'd never believe me. By dawn, I had made a decision. If I couldn't stop the hunters, I would do everything in my power to protect the Yeti. The hunt began that evening. I could hear the faint echoes of dogs barking and men shouting in the distance. The Yeti was restless, pacing near the cave entrance, its movements quick and agitated. "They're coming for you," I said, stepping toward it. "You have to hide. Go deeper into the forest. They won't follow you there." The Yeti turned to me, its expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought it might listen, but then it shook its head, a firm, deliberate motion. It wasn't going to run. As the sounds of the hunting party grew closer, I felt a surge of desperation. The Yeti had saved me, protected me when it could have easily left me to die. Now it was my turn to return the favor. Grabbing my flashlight and knife, I stepped out of the cave, ignoring the pain in my leg. "I'm not letting you face them alone," I said. The Yeti tilted its head, studying me. Then, with a low grunt, it motioned for me to follow. We moved quickly through the forest, the Yeti navigating the terrain with ease while I struggled to keep up. The barking grew louder, the glow of flashlights piercing through the trees like searchlights. Finally, we reached a small ridge overlooking the logging operation. From here, we could see the hunting party spreading out, their voices cutting through the night air. "There!" one of them shouted, his beam catching on a set of tracks. "It's close!" The Yeti crouched low, its eyes narrowing as it watched the man. I could feel the tension radiating from it, a silent determination to protect its home at all costs. But I couldn't let it sacrifice itself. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward, raising my flashlight high. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. "You don't understand what you're doing." The hunters froze, their beams swinging toward me. "Who the hell are you?" one of them demanded, his rifle raised. "Listen to me," I said, forcing myself to stay calm. "The thing you're hunting, it's not dangerous. It's not what you think it is." Laughter rippled through the group. "Not dangerous?" another man scoffed. "Tell that to the guys who saw it skulking around the camp." "It's protecting this forest," I insisted. "It's not hunting you. It's trying to stop what you're doing here." For a moment, there was silence. Then, one of the men stepped forward, his rifle trained on me. "You're either crazy," he said, "or you've been out here too long. Either way, get out of the way before you get yourself killed." Behind me, the Yeti let out a low growl, a sound that made the hunters recoil. "Go back," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "Leave this place. Please." The lead hunter hesitated, his eyes flicking between me and the darkness beyond. Finally, he lowered his weapon. "Let's go," he said, turning to the others. "This isn't worth it." One by one, the men retreated, their flashlights disappearing into the night. When the last of them was gone, I turned to the Yeti, relief washing over me. "We did it," I said. "You're safe." The Yeti stepped forward, its gaze softening. For the first time, I thought I saw something like gratitude in its eyes. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The forest was still in danger, and so was the Yeti. I just didn't know how long we had left. We didn't have much time. The hunter's retreat was temporary. I knew that. Men who saw the Yeti as nothing more than a monster wouldn't stay away for long. They'd return, better prepared, and next time, they'd shoot first and ask questions later. The Yeti seemed to sense it too. Its usual calm had given way to restless pacing, and its amber eyes darted toward the edges of the forest. It wanted to stay, to defend its home, but the odds were stacked against it. "Please," I said, my voice hoarse with desperation. "You have to go deeper into the forest, somewhere they can't find you." The Yeti didn't respond. Instead, it knelt near the fire, using a stick to draw in the dirt. I watched as it traced lines and shapes, the same way it had when it first showed me the forest. But this time, the drawings were different. The Yeti was showing me a path, a way out. We set off just after sunrise, moving cautiously through the dense undergrowth. My legs still throbbed with every step, but the Yeti stayed close, its presence steadying me. It was leading me somewhere, though I didn't yet know where. By midday, the sound of the forest changed. The faint hum of machinery carried on the wind, and distant voices broke the stillness. The hunters had returned. The Yeti stopped, its broad shoulders tensing as it listened. I could see the conflict in its eyes, fight or flee. "Not here," I whispered. "They'll kill you." But before either of us could act, the underbrush erupted with noise. The hunting party burst into view, their flashlights cutting through the trees like beacons. "There it is," one of them shouted, raising his rifle. The Yeti turned to face them, its massive frame casting an imposing shadow. For a moment, everyone froze. The hunters stood rooted in place, their weapons trained on the creature, while the Yeti remained motionless, its gaze calm but unwavering. "Don't shoot," I shouted, stepping between them. "Get out of the way," one of the men barked, his finger twitching on the trigger. "You don't understand," I said, my voice shaking. "It's not attacking you. It's trying to protect this place." The Yeti let out a low rumble. Not a growl, but a sound that seemed almost soothing. It raised one hand, palm open, as if to show it meant no harm. But the hunters didn't see peace. They saw an opportunity. A single gunshot shattered the silence. The Yeti flinched as the bullet struck its shoulder, dark blood matting the fur on its upper arm. It stumbled but didn't retaliate, its massive hands gripping a nearby tree for support. "Stop!" I screamed, rushing toward the Yeti. The hunters hesitated, their weapons still raised. "You don't have to do this," I said, turning to face them. "Look at it. It's not fighting back. It's not a monster. It's a guardian." "Guardian?" One of the men scoffed. "It's a freak of nature. It doesn't belong here." "No," I said, my voice firm. "We're the ones who don't belong here. Look around you. Look at what we've done to this place. The Yeti isn't the threat. We are." For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The hunters exchanged uneasy glances, their resolve wavering. Behind me, the Yeti let out a low, pained sound. I turned to see it watching me, its amber eyes filled with something I couldn't quite define. Gratitude, perhaps, or trust. "Please," I said, my voice breaking. "Let it go." The leader of the group sighed, lowering his rifle. One by one, the others followed suit. "Let's get out of here," he muttered, turning away. "This place is cursed anyway." As the hunters retreated, I let out a shaky breath, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. The Yeti didn't wait long. It nudged me gently with its uninjured arm, urging me to follow. We moved deeper into the forest, the chaos of the hunting party fading behind us. By the time we reached a secluded clearing, the Yeti was visibly weak, its movements slow and labored. I wanted to help, to bandage its wound, but it shook its head, as if to say it wasn't necessary. It led me to the edge of the clearing, where a faint trail wound through the trees. This was the path it had drawn for me, the way out. I hesitated, turning back to the Yeti. "You're not coming, are you?" The creature let out a soft rumble, its eyes meeting mine one last time. Then it stepped back, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The journey back to civilization was long and grueling, but I made it. Weeks later, as I recovered in the warmth of my small apartment, the memories of the Yeti lingered. I'd gone into the forest searching for a monster, but what I found was something far more profound, a protector, misunderstood and vilified. One afternoon, I crossed paths with Emery Callahan, the reclusive eyewitness who had first sparked my journey. Our eyes met, and though we didn't speak, the understanding between us was clear. We both knew the truth. The Yeti's legend would live on in whispered tales and blurry photos, its true nature hidden beneath layers of fear and myth. The world might never understand what I'd seen, but that was okay. Some things were meant to remain in the wild, free from human interference. And in the heart of the forest, the Yeti remained a silent guardian, watching over the land it had sworn to protect. Thanks for watching. If you like the story, click like, subscribe to the channel, and write an idea for the next story in the comments.